So as a fantasy reader, you know that one of the hallmarks of fantasy is the creatures. Magical and fantastical beings that do not live in our own world, and the only way to experience them is through a story. And a couple of the well-known ones and what seem to be popular ones right now in modern fantasy are dragons and fae. Fae, also known as fairies or the fair folk. But for this video, I'll just be calling them fae. And for this video, I am taking the stance that the superior fantasy creature is the dragon. I'm going to compare them a little bit. What's different about them? What's actually, I think, the same about them and why we like them so much? The kinds of stories you might tend to get to hopefully support my position, but I realize that that's an opinion, so here we go. I think one of the things that makes the fae and dragons stand out in stories and has made them both pretty popular is that they are both represented as being more than. A dragon is more than just a lizard. It's bigger, it has wings, it gets fire breathing, and the fae are more than human. More attractive, more persuasive, able to change how things around them are perceived. And while both of these creatures are in a lot of fantasy stories, they're not always in the same stories. I would say, and I might even take this as a stance, that the way we see elves done in fantasy stories is a lot how the fae or the fair folk are described, which is why you don't often see fae and elves in the same story, because that's basically what they are, just with the name elf. And I don't know that I've seen many stories with fae and dragons. They're often in two separate types of stories. But here's how dragon stories have changed and evolved a little bit over time. So stories about dragons were that the dragon was a foe to slay. A person could win renown by hunting down a dragon and killing it. Dragons stole princesses and hoarded treasure, and a brave knight can defeat the dragon, win the lady, take the treasure, become rich and famous. The dragons basically being represented as evil monsters, enemies to humans. And at some point, somebody had to ask the question, but what if we could ride a dragon? And then we started to get a new type of story, stories about dragon riders. And it's not just that the dragons became this epic steed for the knight to ride into battle. Instead of battling the dragon, the knight and the dragon battle together. The dragons started to take on a little more magic and power. They started to get more abilities than just fire breathing. And this is not just in the world of fantasy books, but also things like Dungeons and Dragons, Magic the Gathering, other things with fantastical creatures like dragons. But in these fantasy books with dragon riders, the dragon rider doesn't just ride the dragon, they get this deep mystical bond. Something that goes deeper than anything that they could have with any mortal or human. Sometimes the dragon rider seeks out a dragon, sometimes it's accidental, but in a lot of these cases and in a lot of these stories, again, it's not just the person bonds the dragon and rides them and they can talk to each other in their minds or whatever. They can feel each other's life source. We start getting to these stories where the human, or person, a lot of them are human, also gains something from this bond. A human who bonds a dragon gains status, sometimes long life or magical abilities of their own that they never would have had without bonding that dragon. And I think, going back to that reason why dragons and fae have become so popular, because they are more than whatever normal version of thing we have in our world, this type of dragon rider story became popular because they speak to us that we also have the chance to become more than. As a dragon rider, I am special. I am chosen. I think that really speaks to something deep in the human psyche, to our emotions. We want to be special. We want to be chosen. What if a magical dragon comes and chooses us? Seems pretty cool. And then we have stories about the fae, the fairies, or the fair folk. These stories have been around for a very long time. Something that's been pretty consistent from old cautionary tales to modern day romance-centric fae stories is that they are tricksters. You should not trust them. They try to make deals. They like to steal humans to take them off forever to fairyland, never to be seen again, often stealing children. And they have long had the ability to appear different than what they really are. The beautiful woman fae creature could disguise herself as a wizened old woman to trick you to see if you'll help her even when she's not beautiful. Or the opposite, make themselves look beautiful to lure you in. And then other powers that fae might have depend on the story, but usually having to do with nature, the natural world, and appearances and bonds. Casting a glamour over themselves to appear just as someone might desire to lure in that unsuspecting person to their fate. And then the changing point in stories about fae must have been someone asking the question, what if a fae creature lures a human into fairyland and the human then falls in love with the fae? Or, taking that a little bit farther, what if the fae creature falls in love with the mortal? This beautiful, more than creature, powerful, magical, comes into our world, sees a normal, mundane human, falls in love with them, whisks them away to fairyland, happily ever after. And I do find it interesting how often modern fantasy books with fae have turned into romance stories, romantasy. And I think, again, it is because of that feeling of this powerful, immortal thing has chosen me. I am special. I am chosen. Just by an extremely attractive and powerful fae instead of a dragon this time. That is why I think dragons and fae have become so popular in modern fantasy. They represent more than what we have here, and our chance as a mere mortal to become part of that more-ness. Some kind of bigger destiny than I could ever have in this world. It seems like also they are being written for very different audiences. These fae romantasy stories, usually the adult audience, maybe young adult, new adult, so people who are actually adults but on the younger side, really being geared toward that female audience that would buy romance and is now buying fantasy romance, opening the genres, mixing the genres, whatever. And then dragon books often leaning towards more like fighting, battles, and wars. I see these being written more for children or for the adult, young adult, and then adult, more geared towards the male audience. Not saying these audiences can't mix and enjoy other things, not saying they're right or wrong, just that seems to be the direction they go in. So, to try to choose the superior fantasy creature, dragons or fae, what makes a better story? What is better to read about? I'm going to give the very unsatisfactory answer that to each their own. Both. Everyone likes what they like, so it depends on the reader. So I think the real question is, which one would win in a fight? And that's obviously dragon, so there we go. Thank you, patrons, so much. I appreciate you guys a lot. Link to my Patreon and Instagram will be in the description. I hope you enjoy whatever you're reading right now. Hopefully a good dragon book. Happy reading. Bye.